Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Unchurned. I'm Josh Actor, your host and founder and CEO of UpdateAI. I'm really excited to be here today with Dr. Wendy Smith. Wendy is the author, her and Marion Lewis are the authors of Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. Wendy's a professor at the University of Delaware. She holds a PhD in organizational behavior from Harvard Business School. And she and Marianne Lewis are considered the foremost thinkers, really, in leadership and decision making and how to navigate when you've got competing demands, which we all do in the business world and at the leadership level. I thought this would be a great conversation because we have so many customer success folks out there and listeners who are really aspiring to keep growing through the ranks. And as you do that, decision making is tough. Wendy, thank you so much for being on the program.
Josh, thank you for having me.
So, in your book, um, you kind of quickly go into some really cool case studies about decision making, difficult decision making at Lego and other really well reputed brands, and you talk about how all this stuff really boils down to paradoxes. Explain that. What is a paradox for starters?
Josh, I love that you jumped right into the heart of the matter. And if any of your listeners are listening to this conversation and drift off at the end, here's the big idea. The big idea is exactly where you started with the intro, which I love, which is that we all face challenges, tensions, competing demands, tug of wars, conflicts, that it's not if we do so, it is how we do so. And in order to get there, we have to turn our understanding of our challenges on their head. So, um, what we argue, what we find, we've been doing this research for a number of years is that um, if we start with the word tensions, tensions are something we all experience. We experience them often as detrimental. We would argue that tensions just exist, competing demands between what I want, what someone else wants, competing demands between what I want now or what I want in the future, tug of wars about my career and my life, or about how I navigate customers and my relationships with them. Those are neither good nor bad. It's how we deal with them. They show up for us as these dilemmas that sort of pull us into wanting to make an either or choice. Either I get something or you get something. Either I do what's right now or I do what's right for the long term. They sort of demand of us an either or choice. And we can talk about, if we want, the psychology behind why we get pulled into that either or choice. But, and importantly, what we argue is that in order for us to get to a better choice, we have to look underneath those dilemmas. And underneath those dilemmas are these paradoxes. And paradoxes are these competing ideas, these dualities, these opposing forces that are not just opposing, they're also interdependent with one another. So, if we think, for example, about tensions that we feel in navigating challenges with our customers, and I know that we'll get into a couple of these in more specific details, underlying some of those tensions might be this enduring interdependent relationship between what I need for myself and what I need for outside myself, the customer, the other. And those kind of self other tensions pop up all the time, or what I need for right now and what I need for the future, which create sometimes is in conflict or in tension, or what I need for myself and what my company needs for me in terms of the metrics and expectations that they have of me. Those underlying paradoxes, if we can look at them, invite us into a different way to think about the issues or tensions.
There's so many paradoxes and tensions in the world of customer success, customer experience teams. One that comes to mind, and we'll go through a few of these. One that comes to mind is it's funny. I actually had this in our pitch deck for Update AI that exposed just the macro issue that we're one of the issues that we're trying to help solve. Customer success teams are generally speaking, I'm a little bit shy of making this generalization, but generally speaking, they are under resourced and under budgeted. And at the same time, especially now in this current economic climate, which hopefully we're climbing out of, but they're being pushed to do more. so companies are all hands on deck to retain customers. We have to hold on to our existing customers. Customer success managers, you are the superheroes of revenues for B2B SaaS companies. Oh, but by the way, like we're cutting your headcount, or do you really need that tool, that enablement tool, because budgets are really tight? There's this constant tension, is what I see in the industry, and we can talk about that. One thing that strikes me is, like, in that particular example, it's not necessarily under your control, right? You're being pushed and pulled by an outsider. So how would you deal with that type of paradox?
Yes, I want to say two things about this, and by the way, they might be in conflict with each other. The first
Please.
thing that I want to say is that part of both and thinking. Well, so let me just take a step back. If we see paradoxes underlying our tensions, then how do we shift? And the invitation and the reason that we named the book Both and Thinking is because we invite people to shift from an either or approach to a both and approach. And so part of this both and thinking is indeed noticing that one of the reasons that we live into this either or is because of resource constraints, because we have limited time, financial resources, and those feel like a zero sum game. So the invitation, for example, in the example that you used, we have fewer resources and more expectation. Well, how could we revamp, revise, rethink our experience of resources so that they don't feel scarce, they feel abundant, so that we can lean into this both and. So that might look like, okay, we have fewer people, but we have larger expectations of what we need to get done. How can we rethink how we resource people and their time and their experiences to be more efficient, or to be more engaging, or to be more effective in the kind of work that they're doing? How can we work on the higher, not priority work, but the higher output work, and let go of and maybe find other ways to get done some of the, easier work that other people can do? Like, how can we just be more creative in our application of resources so that there is this abundant approach? We expand the value of our time and our people and our money before we say, okay, we've only got, X number of hours in a day to a lot. So there is part of this both and thinking is indeed being more creative in our resourcing. And here I'll go back to a great book that I love by our colleague Scott Sonnenschein, where his book Stretch invites us into how do we stretch the value of our resources so that we're not in this zero sum thinking. Now that said, and here's the alternative side
Can
of
I
this.
can I can I can I can I cut
Yeah,
you off quickly there, Wendy, just to ask you a
yeah.
follow-up? And I want to go into the double click there, but um, like, what I heard from what you just said was, step one is take a deep breath, and, like, like, and just think level-headedly about, don't panic, just clear your head, and because you need that to be creative, like you referenced, to think about workarounds. Is that a big part of this also? Is the psychology of dealing with paradoxes?
Yeah, indeed. Yes, you're speaking to sort of one of the big pieces for us, and what I think is a big component of the book that often gets overlooked when we talk about navigating paradoxes. And we, in the book, we put together the system, these four sort of sets of tools. One of them is how we think about things, and one of them is exactly what you're talking about. How do we feel in our emotional experience of things? So what we argue and what we find in the research is that our emotions, our anxieties, our underlying panic will often drive us to act in ways that, again, will trigger this kind of either or, frustrated, defensive, responsive, feeling that says, oh, these tensions are problematic and they're detrimental, and they're, as opposed to, wait, there's possibility here. And exactly what you said, we go straight to that. We call it finding comfort in the discomfort, which what we mean is recognizing that we feel this discomfort, we feel this panic, we feel this fear. And how do we just pause and honor that, acknowledge that, but not let it define and drive how we're going to act and how we're going to think about this problem? So take a deep breath is like number one process to do that. Number one practice of, like, it's going to be okay. And I'm just going to pause for a minute, build in a pause so that I don't so that I acknowledge that fear, but don't act on it.
I want to build in a pause right now for yourself and I, Wendy. And all of our listeners, I want to take a big, deep breath because paradoxes or not, we're all feeling tensions all the time. So we're going to take a deep breath right now and then we're going to move on. Ready?
All right.
Okay. So,
Okay.
um, so now that we're all in a relaxed state, I've actually noticed myself that when I'm facing tensions and paradoxes, a lot of times my team has helped me get out of that. We've been able to brainstorm the workarounds together in ways where I may have panicked more just thinking about the different scenarios on my own. Is there any literature and research about teamwork in that sense?
Teams, I think, could go either way. We could easily be swayed by our teams to go into more of a panic, and we are surrounded by some of those people. Or we could find that our teams create the and or what will happen is we can find that our teams end up in conflict and therefore create even more of this kind of competing tensions. We talk about that as the vicious cycle of trench warfare, meaning that there's groups on either side of a position and they intensify their opposition and get into opposing ideas because they're on either side of a position and they get defensive. This sort of polarized experience, this conflict experience. Or, I love that you have a team that you're surrounded by that can help you pause and think the bigger picture. What we find though is that for leaders to help their teams get there, it is about using language, metaphors, ideas on an ongoing basis to pull people out of their sort of narrowed either or thinking and into the bigger picture. And that requires leaders constantly saying to their teams, hey, we're in this either or of should we spend resources on this or resources or that, or should we launch now or launch later into, okay, what's the both and here? So it's asking the questions, it's repetitively asking the questions, it's reminding people that there's value in anding. We have one leader who uses this example. This is from WL Gore and Associates, and this is Terry Kelly, who is the CEO there. And she would tell her senior leaders, we've got to both think about today and tomorrow. We've got to be both sort of down in the weeds in small teams and enterprise wide. And the reason we have to do both is it's like breathing. We're back to take a breath. It's breathing. You have to, in order to live, you have to breathe in and breathe out. It's not one or the other. So I think that's right. I think teams, leaders and teams can reinforce this kind of thinking, but we have to be intentional about it on an ongoing basis.
So a lot of folks, we had Kelly Leonard on the show
Yeah.
recently, and he connected us actually, and he of course wrote the book Yes and, which is relates to improvisational thinking. And that's kind of picked up over the past years, this yes and thinking. It feels like also what you're saying is one of the tactical ways for leaders to create this environment is just to make that the mantra. Just literally like post that up in the scrum room, in the conference room, if people are still going into physical space. But both and thinking. I mean, that's the title of your book. But just to literally make that a principle, an operating principle of your team, both and thinking.
Yeah, it's I even find myself doing, I caught myself even a couple of times in our conversation so far. Your listeners can go back and listen. Is sometimes when we go to the but, I find myself going even in my own mind, wait, not but, and um the mantra for us is change the question. So yeah, it's both and thinking. It starts with change the question. So, how recognized, even notice how often do we frame our questions as A or B? Okay, should I spend time on this or that? Should I be focused on what my customers need for the moment or what they're going to need for the future and how to develop and advance into the future? Should I think about, what my customers need or what my company needs? And as soon as we frame it as an either or, it just gets pitted against one another and expects this very quick, not easy, but this expects of us an either or decision, expects us to make a choice. And if we can change the question, okay, how can I achieve what my customers need for today and be starting to explore for tomorrow? How can I build a relationship in which I, advance my company and build trust and connection to my customers. As soon as we reframe into that, and what we know from our research, what we know from psychology, what we know is that it invites us into a whole different mindset. It expands our thinking and invites us into much more creative possibilities. So that's
I
the first
love
step.
that. I love that. As you were thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking, um, I was almost going to cut you off, which I just kind of did, but and say, how do you do that? How do you balance the future and the present, and don't those, you know, but like, isn't aren't you going to be overwhelmed with trying to do both? And then you said it right there. You just changed the question. It's not, are you going to be overwhelmed with both? How might you be able to deal with both? So, yeah, it leaves space and acceptance.
It does. I think this goes back to where we had started earlier on less time, less money, less resources, doing
Yeah.
more. And the caveat I wanted to put on that one is both and I've had this conversation several times. In fact, I just posted on social media about this because both and doesn't mean and. It doesn't mean you keep adding and adding and adding until your plate is overflowing and about to break. Because sometimes both and people in the name of both and are just adding. Both and requires boundaries and creative thinking about how these competing ideas can work in a better, more creative way, in an integrative way, in a more succinct way, or in a more efficient way, so that you can really value more. But it doesn't mean that you just add and add and add. And I say that in part because I think I certainly have some empathy for it. Doesn't mean that employees should be told do more and more and more in the exact same way you've always been doing things with fewer and fewer resources. That just feels almost abusive in the extreme, or demanding in a less extreme way. So I want to be clear that it's not and we should just add. It's a process by which we start with the how can we question and then move on, and we can talk about what would come next into a more creative possibility for how you approach these tensions.
Yeah. I mean, how do we move on and at the same time keep those boundaries?
Yeah. So the first step is change the question. The second and third step. The second step is what we call separate and connect. The third step is choice and choosing, or moving to choosing, or rethinking the outcomes. So if the first step is framing a question, how can we both address what we need as a company, or address what we need as an employee, and somebody who's working on customer success, and build a trusting relationship with our client and customers. And then the next step is, okay, separate, meaning let's pull apart what we each need and why they are in conflict, and really acknowledging that. Sometimes people in both anding will go straight to what's the integrative synergy, what's the ways in which we can find a win-win. Well, we can't really find a win-win until we first understand and recognize what each side needs. If anybody listening has studied negotiations, this is a classic turn of negotiations. You first have to understand the interests of each side, the interest of the different demands, either in your attention or your relationship with other people, before you can find the synergy. So that's the separate part. And sometimes that involves the basic practice of just listening. Right. I mean, I'm sure, and I'm not in your world, but I can only imagine that in the customer success world, listening to your customers is big. Giving them the space to share, sometimes it's just listening and articulating and understanding what is valued on each side, in service of looking for points of connection, finding ways in which there is an integrative possibility along the way. So that's step two. And I'll just lay out step three, and then we can do a deep dive in any of these pieces. The third piece is rethinking what the outcomes look like. And we talk about two different types of outcomes. So, if in a typical approach, which we're contrasting against an either or, you frame it as an either or question, you pull it apart, you analyze, you make a pro con list in service of making a choice between the alternative options. Instead, we talk about moving from a choice to choosing. And here's what we mean by that. We mean two different things. We either mean that you found some solution where there is a win-win, and both things can be accommodated in a way that they are both valued at the same time. And so we talk about that win-win. We talk about it as a creative integration, or with the metaphor of a mule, because the mule is the oldest living hybrid that we have biologically been bringing together. It's, smarter than a donkey, faster than a horse. We've been bringing together horses and donkeys to create mules for like 3,000 years. So it's better than both, and it's this win-win option. That happens sometimes. And what we find, and this goes back to the very first research project that I did on senior teams at IBM, trying to innovate for my dissertation when I was at Harvard, it doesn't happen all that often that we look for these win-wins. They're great when we find them, but more often we do what we talk about as tightrope walking, or being consistently inconsistent. And what that means is that we are often making choices, these choices between these alternative options, but we're making choices not that we are over choosing one side or over choosing the other. We're making them in these kind of micro shifting between these options over time, so that we can stay with both over the context of multiple decisions. And so it's like the tightrope walker, because a tightrope walker, in order to get to the end, has to focus on a longer term horizon, some point off in the distance. In order to stay on the tightrope, they're never fully balanced. They are balancing in that they're shifting left and right, but they are not overemphasizing one side or overemphasizing the other. The same is true, for example, if you are in a conversation with a customer, and you're trying to figure out what you need out of it, what they need out of it. You want to build a trusting relationship. Maybe there is this ideal point where you get exactly what you both need, but sometimes we're shifting to my needs in this moment, and I want to sell you and give you the example of sometimes you're shifting to focusing on what their needs are in this moment, and really doing a deep dive into their needs. And it's making these micro shifts of choosing along the way. And we talk about that as being consistently inconsistent, because over time, you're really accommodating both. But in the moment, you're making these micro shifts back and forth.
Yeah, I almost visualize that. It's not linear. It's just like kind of footprints going all over the place, right here, but
Yeah.
with intentionality. Let's talk about another scenario with this context and this framework that you've given us here. One that there's a lot of just constant conversation about in the customer success post sales industry, which is the primary intention of the primary business outcome of customer success teams is to renew and to sell, to retain their
Yeah.
customers.
Yeah.
But they're also at the front lines with the customer for the good reason of building a harmonic, supportive, genuine relationship. And that can be at odds with selling to the person. And so there's these different camps and schools of thought around, should a customer success manager own the renewal and selling process, or should they actually be divorced from that so that they can be pristine in their relationship building with the customer, and then the salesperson can swoop in for the kill, so to speak? What are your thoughts? Like, how would you apply what we just discussed, this framework, to that, perennial debate within CS?
The question that I would ask is one about time frame and time horizon as I think about that. And what I mean by that is, in the work that we did, we interviewed Paul Pullman. Paul Pullman was the CEO of Unilever, introducing a massive turnaround for Unilever by introducing a sustainable living plan, and essentially seeking to achieve, and in fact doubling profits, not alongside, but through a commitment to a sustainability agenda around environmental impact and social impact. And has really, it's very provocative, and one of the things that he noted early on in that experience was how much short-term metrics, quarterly reporting, was creating behaviors in which people were very much thinking about short-term relationships, it, and that creates this kind of either or experience, because in the short term, in the very moment, there is this, who's is the customer going to buy or are they not? How do I get them quicker to buying or to renewing or to engaging in that way? But if we think about what does it mean to establish a relationship for the customer over the long run, it gives us a lot more flexibility of what's possible in that relationship. Now, this might sound heretical because the invitation. And to be fair, what Paul Pullman did, and this was, really dramatic, if you will, in the context of a business. He basically told the market, I'm not giving you quarterly reports. I'm just not. I'm not going to be getting on quarterly calls. I'm not going to be giving quarterly reports because that's just driving too much detrimental behavior in the company. It's not allowing people to think more broadly, creatively, generatively in terms of the relationships that they're building and how we are implementing this kind of strategy. So it might sound like heresy, and to the extent that people have very short term metrics that they're being measured on, that creates some problems in terms of the possibility of how we build this relationship with our customer, because they might, what we really need from them is this long-term relationship that we're trying to achieve, where they might end up buying a whole lot over a longer period of time. But what we're so pressed to do is to get them to purchase right now, right here, that we might actually lose them along the way. So one of the invitations is whether we can, either as individuals that are listening to this, as company leaders that are listening to this, or from an industry-wide perspective, think about what it would look like to push time horizons out in terms of our metrics to enable us to get to more creative ways of engaging.
And it sounds like from what you said a moment ago that I'm tell me if I'm right on this or not, like you would be supportive of customer success teams owning renewal as well, because you can be nurturing the relationship in one moment, but then you can be agile and in a different moment be, so supporting your customer one moment, but then also supporting your company's needs in another moment and be more in that sales position. Like you were saying, like it doesn't have to be consistently inconsistent, like you had mentioned.
Yeah, so I would say maybe the academic in me would say, well, I would want a little bit more empirical experience with this, your industry and the your experiences in order to understand that there are different schools of thought in terms of the value of having very different roles and responsibilities versus bringing them together. And there's this language around being ambidextrous, which is around structurally pulling apart these responsibilities so people can have real different focus, but then figuring out who needs to pull that together. I think that what we find in our research is the important, and there's also schools of thought around the value of giving people the ability to kind of manage. And by the sorry, the reason to pull it apart is partially that it's really complicated for individuals to be able to manage both.
Mm.
And there's a school of thought that says actually we can train and enable individuals to live into that more complicated approach. And there's value in bringing it together. For us, the key idea is that over the system where there might be different individuals, that somebody is really focused on these two different kinds of expectations, and somebody is pulling it together and thinking about, again, separating and connecting. But that happens, and whether it's the same person or whether it's different people, I think depends on the context of the system and the experience you have with your people and how to navigate and train them to be able to think more in a more complex way.
And that would scaffold up to your chief revenue officer and or your chief customer officer, which would be
Yeah.
kind of looking at it from both perspectives. So if you were in those shoes, how exactly might you make that decision for your team? What kind of, I know you don't have quite so much empirical evidence on this right now, but like how would you break that down?
Well, I think importantly, if I asked if I was the chief revenue officer, the chief strategy officer, whoever this was rolling up to that you were talking about, what I would want to know is if I'm going to invite the people on my team to be able to embrace both this renewal and engagement relationship as well as the sale, how can I help them learn the skills? And in my world, it's the skills of both anding, long-term thinking, building in a pause, changing the question, thinking about how the relationship is not just instrumental and like, about the sell, but also about this long-term relationship, and how do I think about that, and listening skills, and how do I teach those skills to the people that I'm asking to do that. So it's partially who does it, and it's partially, am I empowering them with the skills that they need. And one of those skills is living into paradox, living into the both and, in order to be able to do that.
Sounds like you would be a very supportive executive for these companies. Wendy, we're going to leave it at that. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think that our listeners are going to get a lot of value from it. And where can they find your book, Both and Thinking?
Yes. Well, any place that they buy books. And we have a website that is up called bothandthinking.net, bothandthinking.net. And, and we welcome any feedback or reactions. There's a page there to be in touch with us. We welcome any reactions, thoughts. They can find how they can connect with both myself and Marianne Lewis, my co-author, on social media. We're active out there and love hearing reactions, feedbacks, thoughts, applications along the way.
I read it myself, thought it was a great read, and I highly recommend it to listeners out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh.